Hey friends, what's cooking? I guess that's relevant. What's cooking? Did we say the other day? I feel like maybe we had this discussion. What's cooking? Because like Hilchos Bishul, Ein Ben Yom Tov V'Shabbos Halochol Nefesh B'Vad. Anyways, friends, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Mem, Daf 40 of masechta Baya. Friends, who could tell me what's exciting about Daf Mem of masechta Beitzah? Daf Mem of masechta Beitzah is the final Daf of masechta Beitzah. Gewaldig. So the opinion polls, what are they? What did you guys think of masechta Beitzah? What did you guys think? Not exactly a walk in the park, huh? Not exactly a walk in the park. Alright, but it wasn't so long. It was just 40 daf, and it's good in Yonim over there. We learned, Hilchos Yom Tif, important things about Yom Tif, Eruvey Tavshilin, and just Hoel Shehuchu L'Tzorech, Huchana Mishalo L'Tzorech, understanding, being able to carry in Rishus Harabim on Yom Tif, and cooking, and what's allowed, what isn't. Friends, this is amazing stuff, right? We're going to take this stuff with us all of our years. Alright, let's go weiter. So today, it's a 2 Mishnah day over here in Babylon Talmud. And the first Mishnah is going to continue talking about Eruvey tehumin. Friends, what do you want me to tell you? That's what we got over here. And then the second, the second Mishnah is going to talk about essentially Muktzeh. Nice way to end off masechta Baya. Friends, we're getting to the end of Seder Moed over here. It's in sight. I mean, just another few months and we're done with Seder Moed. Started off Seder Moed with masechta Shabbos. Of course, lots of halachos of Muktzeh, and then Eruvey, and all the halachos of Muktzeh and stuff like that. And masechta Beitzah, we're ending up here with actually both of those, with Muktzeh and Muktzeh and today's daf, tehumin. Anyways, but before we know it, we're going to be in Seder Noshim. So, just a few months away. Okay, friends, let's go weiter. So, we're at the Mishnah and Daf Lamed Tes Amud Beis, 3 lines from the bottom. We show you Peirosav Be'ir Acheres. Gewaldig. So you have a fellow, let's call him Eruvey, and his fruits are in another city. So, for our example, we'll say Yerushalayim and Tel Aviv. Eruvey lives in Yerushalayim. His fruits are in Tel Aviv. Now, obviously, Tel Aviv is outside of the Tchum Shabbos. But let's just pretend that Yerushalayim and Tel Aviv are 4,000 amas away, even though, of course, in truth, they're significantly more than that. So you have Eruvey. Eruvey lives in Yerushalayim. His fruits, on the other hand, are currently in Tel Aviv. Okay? Ve'ervu b'nei Osa'ir. Now, the people in Tel Aviv made an Eruvey tehumin halfway between Yerushalayim and Tel Aviv. And therefore, they were Kona Shvisa, 2,000 amas outside of Tel Aviv, 2,000 amas to Jerusalem. So, they would be able to walk from Tel Aviv to Yerushalayim. So, would they be able to bring Reuven's fruits for him to Yerushalayim? Lavi etzlo miperosav lo yaviu lo. No, they can't. They can't. Because it's Reuven's fruits. Therefore, Reuven's fruits are dictated by Reuven's Tchum Shabbos. And therefore, Reuven cannot go all the way to Tel Aviv and back because he did not make an Eruvey tehumin. The people of Tel Aviv can go back and forth between Yerushalayim and Tel Aviv because they made an Eruvey tehumin, but Reuven's fruits are governed by Reuven's Tchum Shabbos, not by the people of Tel Aviv. Of Tel Aviv's Tchum Shabbos. But if Reuven made an Eruvey tehumin, so then Gewaldig. If Reuven made an Eruvey tehumin, so then amazing. He can walk all the way to Tel Aviv, grab his fruits, walk back to Jerusalem. All good, as my father likes to say. Mishazimin etzlo orchim. If Reuven is hosting guests from Tel Aviv, Okay, Reuven is hosting guests from Tel Aviv. Lo yolichu biyadam manos. So they cannot take over the leftovers. Kilu, if Reuven wants to send them home with some food, back to Tel Aviv, so they're coming from Tel Aviv to Yerushalayim, they're having lunch at Reuven, and Reuven says, hey, why didn't I send you back with some goodies? So the question is, are they allowed to rely upon the Eruv tehumin that they made so that they could travel between Yerushalayim and Tel Aviv? Can they rely upon that Eruvey tehumin in order to take these food items that Reuven is now giving to them back with them to Tel Aviv? Elim ken zika loy manuseim me'erev Yom Tov. So the answer is no, they cannot, because they're Reuven's food, right? It's Reuven's food, and therefore Reuven's food is governed by Reuven's Tchum Shabbos. And Reuven didn't make an Eruvey tehumin. So therefore, these friends from Tel Aviv would not be allowed to take these items that Reuven gave them and take them back with them to Tel Aviv, because they are governed by Reuven's Tchum Shabbos, and Reuven did not make an Eruvey tehumin. However, there is something that can be done. Reuven can be mizake, right? Elim ken zika loy manusei me'erev Yom Tov. Reuven can be mizake these things to these people from before Yom Tov. And what that means is, before Yom Tov, Reuven knows that these friends are going to be coming from Tel Aviv, and he knows that he's going to want to be sending them back with food. So he could go to his friend Shimon, who lives in Yerushalayim as well, and he says, hey Shimon, I'm having some friends over tomorrow from Tel Aviv. I want that they should be able to take back some food with them. So, Shimon, can you accept this food on behalf of the people, of my friends in Tel Aviv? That way, this food will already belong to them before Yom Tov begins. And then they'll be able, memele, to take back their own food with them to Tel Aviv using the Tchum Shabbos that the Eruvey tehumin that they set up. And as Rashi points out, Zochen la'adam shelo b'fanav, you can merit for a person not in their presence, and therefore Shimon can accept this food on behalf of the people in Tel Aviv. It now becomes theirs. And then, when they come to Yerushalayim on Yom Tov to eat by their friend Reuven, Reuven can say, oh, here is this food. I was already mizake it to you from yesterday. It's yours. You could take it back with you to Tel Aviv. Givaldi. Itmar. It was stated, Hamafkid Peiris Eitzel Chavero. Givaldi. If Reuven leaves some fruits by Shimon. Alright. Sounds very nice. Okay. Reuven goes over to Shimon's house and he puts his fruits in Shimon's courtyard. Okay. Rav Omer Kragli Mishev Kidu Etzlo. So Rav says, alright, well, if the fruits are now in Shimon's courtyard, so then they're governed by Shimon's Tchum Shabbos, not by Reuven's. Shmuel Omar, where Shmuel says, Kragli Amafkid. Where Shmuel says, no, Punkt Vaker, the opposite. That if Reuven puts his fruits in Shimon's courtyard, it's governed by Reuven's Tchum Shabbos. Reuven is still the owner of those fruits. So Lema, Rav Shmuel does the Tamayu. So let's say that Rav and Shmuel are perfectly consistent with their reasoning that we see, with their opinions that we see elsewhere. Ditnan, as we learn in the Mishnah, Im hichnis birshus balachotzer chayev, ho ho. Rabbi Yomer lo'olomenu chayev et shikabel olav balabais lishmor. Gewaltig. Let's read this again. Ditnan, it's taught in the Mishnah, that im hichnis birshus balachotzer chayev. If Reuven goes to Shimon's courtyard and he leaves there his ox. Very nice. So says the Tanakama, if Reuven had permission to leave his ox in Shimon's courtyard, well then any damage that you can imagine that might ensue afterwards, Shimon is responsible for those damages. That is the Tanakama's opinion. Reuven leaves his ox in Shimon's courtyard. Shimon is responsible for the damages. Rebbe Omer La'olam Einu Chayev, whereas Rebbe's opinion is Punkt Vaker, is the opposite. He's not Chayev Ad Shikabel Olav Balabayis Lishmor. That Shimon is only going to be Chayev for any damages that might happen due to this ox being in his courtyard, if he explicitly accepts upon himself that he's going to be chayiv, that he's taking responsibility for the damages. Short of that, if Shimon does not specifically accept upon himself responsibility for the damages, so then any damages that occur would be Reuven's responsibility. So what do we see over here? We see that you have Reuven leaving something in Shimon's courtyard, and the question is Shimon, is it like the Tanakama says that Shimon's responsible for damages, or is it like Rebbe is saying that Reuven retains responsibility for damages? V'amar Rafuna Amar Rav, it says Rafuna in the name of his Rebbe Rav, halacha kedivri chacham, that the halacha is like the chacham. That Rav says the halacha is like the chacham, that Shimon is responsible for any damages that may happen. Ushmuel Amar halacha ki Rebbe. Whereas Shmuel says that the halacha is like Rebbe, that Reuven is responsible for the damages. That Reuven retains responsibility for the damages. So Rav Damar ki Rabbanan Ushmuel da Amar ki Rebbe. So let's say, tying it back into our case, where in terms of Tchum Shabbos, when Reuven puts some fruits in Shimon's courtyard, whose Tchum Shabbos is going to govern these fruits? So let's say, well, Rav had said that it's going to be Shimon's Tchum Shabbos that is going to, take effect on these fruits. So let's say that Rav, who says that when Reuven puts fruits in Shimon's chotzer, so it's Shimon's Tchum Shabbos that applies to these fruits, says just like he says in Bavikame, that when Reuven puts his ox in Shimon's courtyard, so he passes like the Tanakame, that Shimon is responsible for any damages that ensue. Ushmuel Amar halacha ki Rebbe. Where am I? So Lema Rav Damar Krabban, Ushmuel Damar ki Rebbe. I don't know, I lost my place, so I don't know what I read and what I didn't, but it's the same thing, right? So Rav would say like the Tanakama. Tanakama says that Shimon is chai for damages from the ox. Also, Rav is saying that Shimon, his Tchum Shabbos is going to apply to the fruits. And Shmuel, who says that by the fruits, when Reuven puts his fruits in Shimon's courtyard, it's the Tchum Shabbos is defined by Reuven's Tchum Shabbos. So he'll say like Rebbe in Bavikame, that when Reuven puts his ox in Shimon's courtyard, Reuven retains responsibility for damages, and that's like what he says over here, that the Tchum Shabbos of the fruits is defined by Reuven's Tchum Shabbos. So we want to say that Rav's opinion here with regard to these fruits is consistent with his opinion with regard to the damages of the ox, and Shmuel's opinion with regard to the fruits is also consistent with his opinion with regard to the ox, namely that according to Rav, it's governed by Shimon's chotzer, and according to Shmuel, it's governed by Reuven. Fine. Omar loch Rav. So now the Gemara is going to explain how we can argue that that is not the case. How we can argue that Rav will say that both the Tanakama and Rebbe in Bava Kama would agree with me regarding these fruits, and Shmuel will say the same thing, that both the Tanakama and Rebbe in Bava Kama would agree with him, Shmuel, with regard to these fruits. Let's see. Amar lach Rav. Rav will respond to you. Ana da'amri afilu l'Rebbe. I, who say that when it comes to these fruits, that when Reuven puts his fruits in Shimon's courtyard, the Tchum Shabbos is defined by Shimon. Tchum Shabbos is defined by Shimon's Tchum Shabbos. So obviously I understand how I can be consistent with the Tanakama in Bava Kama, who says that Shimon is responsible for damages, right? Again, I, Rav, who say that when it comes to these fruits, it's the Tchum Shabbos is defined by Shimon's Tchum Shabbos. So it's easy to understand how I can be consistent with the Tanakama in Bava Kama, that Shimon is responsible for damages. But guess what? Rebbe, who says that Reuven is going to be responsible for the damages, he will agree with me that when it comes to the fruits, the Tchum Shabbos will be governed by Shimon's Tchum Shabbos. How come? Adkan lo ka'amar Rebbe Hasan, Rebbe says in Bava Kama that Reuven is still responsible for damages, because what happened in the case of Bava Kama? Reuven goes, deposits his ox in Shimon's courtyard. Shimon says, sure, you can leave it here, but Rebbe argues that doesn't necessarily mean that Shimon is accepting responsibility. Again, Reuven deposits his ox in Shimon's courtyard. Shimon says, sure, you could leave it here, but that does not necessarily mean that Shimon is accepting responsibility for any damages that might ensue. But says Rav, but over here with the fruits, we're talking about a situation where Shimon did accept upon himself responsibility for the fruits, and therefore Tchum Shabbos is going to be governed by Shimon's Tchum Shabbos. Okay, so Rav wants to argue that his opinion that when Reuven deposits his fruits in Shimon's courtyard, Shimon is the Tchum Shabbos is defined by Shimon's Tchum Shabbos. It's because so Rav is going to say that that's unanimous among both the Tanakama and Rebbe in Bava Kama, that they would both agree with him regarding these fruits, that Tchum Shabbos would be governed by Shimon's Tchum Shabbos. Ushmuel Omar, and Shmuel who says that by the fruits the Tchum Shabbos is governed by Reuven's Tchum Shabbos. Omar Ono da Amri Afilu L'Rabbanon. So Shmuel would say that that even the rabbis in Bava Kama who say that Shimon is responsible for the damages for the ox, they would agree that with the fruits, the Tchum Shabbos is still defined by Reuven's Tchum Shabbos. Ushmuel Omer says Shmuel, Ono da Amri Afilu L'Rabbanon. I say, even according to the rabbis, Ad kan lo ka'amri Rabbanon Hosom. The only reason why the rabbis say in Bava Kama that Tchum Shabbos is governed, the only reason why the rabbis say in Bava Kama that Shimon is responsible for the damages is well, because Reuven, who owns the ox, obviously he has no problem with Shimon accepting responsibility for the damages. The imazik leilu michayev, because after all, what's there for Reuven to lose? If his ox ends up damaging something in Shimon's property, or Shimon himself, so by Shimon accepting responsibility upon himself for damages, it's in Reuven's interest. I can't imagine he would have any problem with that. But over here by the fruits, it's not in Reuven's interest that his fruits should be in Shimon's possession, that the Tchum Shabbos should be based on Shimon, that these fruits essentially should belong to Shimon in any way. He wants to retain ownership of them. And therefore, Shmuel is going to argue, Shmuel who says that by the fruits, the Tchum Shabbos is governed by Reuven's Tchum Shabbos. So he'll say that even the rabbis who say that when it comes to damages, Shimon is responsible for the damages, that's just because it's in Reuven's interest that Shimon should be responsible for the damages. He's happy that Shimon is going to take responsibility for the damages. But that's not the case when it comes to the fruits. By the fruits, Reuven wants to retain ownership to his fruits. And therefore, the Tchum Shabbos is going to be governed by his own Tchum Shabbos. And obviously, so that was how Shmuel could say that even the rabbis would agree with him. But obviously, Rebbe, who says that by Bava Kama, that that Shimon would explicitly have to accept damages upon himself, and if not, then the damages, Reuven is responsible for damages. That it's easy to understand how Shmuel would agree with that and say that the Tchum Shabbos is governed by Reuven's Tchum Shabbos. Tanan, we learn in our Mishnah, Ve'im Erev hu Peirosov Komo. So what do we say in our Mishnah? That you have Reuven. Reuven lives in Yerushalayim. His fruits are in Tel Aviv. So it's basically Reuven is depositing his fruits in Tel Aviv. And what are we saying? We're saying that, well, if Reuven makes a Tchum Shabbos, makes a Eruvey tehumin, so then he can go and grab his fruits from Tel Aviv and bring them home. So now, Tananvim Eruvu Peirosov Kamo. So if Reuven has his fruits, Reuven lives in Yerushalayim, he has his fruits in Tel Aviv. So if he makes an Eruvey tehumin, so then he could, take him back and forth. And if Rav is correct that the tchum is defined not by Reuven, but by whoever has Reuven's fruits, ki erev hu may have. What significance is there in Reuven making an Eruvey tehumin? Right, our Mishnah says that if Reuven's fruits are in Tel Aviv, so Reuven makes an Eruvey tehumin, he can take him back and forth. But if we're saying that actually Reuven's tchum is not what's important, rather it's Shimon's tchum that's important. The person whose house or property Reuven's fruits are in. So if it's governed by Shimon's tchum Shabbos, so then why is the Mishnah saying that if Reuven makes a tchum in Eruvey tehumin, so then he can take him back and forth? It has nothing to do with Reuven. According to Rav, it's based on Shimon's tchum Shabbos. So why does the Mishnah say that if Reuven makes an Eruvey tehumin, he can take it back and forth? So Ravuna says, look, in the Beis Medrash of Rav, we get your question, and this is how they answer it. Well, our Mishnah is talking about where Reuven had a place in Tel Aviv, essentially to call his own. Right? Meaning they gave him an area in Tel Aviv that, look, this is going to be considered your spot. And because it's his, well, therefore it's governed by his Tchum Shabbos, even though it's in a different city. Okay, fine. Toshma, come in here. Mishizimin etzlo orchim. You have a fellow, and the fellow invited over guests. Okay, this is what our Mishnah said. Right? Reuven invites over guests for Yom Tov Suda from Tel Aviv, and Reuven, of course, lives in Yerushalayim. Lo yolichu biyadam manos, so he's unable to just give them food to take back to Tel Aviv because it's his food, and it's going to be governed by his Tchum Shabbos, not theirs. Ela imkein zika loim monosei me'erev Yom Tov. What does Reuven do? Reuven goes over to his friend Shimon, who lives with him in Yerushalayim, and he says, "Hey Shimon, can you accept this food on behalf of my friends who are coming for Yom Tov Suda tomorrow?" And he accepts it on their behalf, and now it becomes the friend's food. One problem. What's this food? This food is his friend's food now, but they're depositing it by Shimon in Yerushalayim. So it's the same question, that they live in Tel Aviv, their food is in Yerushalayim, and now and if Rav is correct, that in this case, the Tchum Shabbos is defined by the person who has the fruits, i.e., in this case, Shimon who's in Yerushalayim. So kizika loim aidei acher ma'have. So who cares that Reuven essentially gave the food to his friends in Tel Aviv by giving them to Shimon? But the fact of the matter is, the food is now in Yerushalayim, and it's going to be governed by Shimon's Tchum Shabbos. How could the friends bring it back with them to Tel Aviv, even if they own it? But the fact of the matter is, they might own it, but they're keeping it by Shimon in Yerushalayim. It's going to be defined by Shimon's Tchum Shabbos. So, so one way to answer it is that, well, by Reuven going over to Shimon and, transferring ownership of the food to his friends in Tel Aviv, by giving them to Shimon, it's as if he kind of creates a space over there that makes it theirs, that makes it his friends from Tel Aviv's, and they have a designated space in Yerushalayim that's theirs, and therefore they can bring it back and forth from their designated space. Or you could say being mizakeh is different. That when Ruvain goes to Shimon and says, hey Shimon, can you accept this food on behalf of my friends in Tel Aviv? It's different because it's clear, it's obvious that what Ruvain is trying to do is he's trying to enable his friends to be able to take it back and forth. And therefore, by definition, by being mizakeh the food to Shimon on behalf of the friends, he's doing it so that, with the intention, so that they will be able to take it back and forth. And he's essentially giving them this food and making it as though, in terms of being konesh shvisa, in terms of where is this food, essentially, I guess when Shabbos starts in terms of Eruvin, right? Because the whole way the Eruvey tehumin works is where you konesh shvisa. Well, this food was konesh shvisa when Yom Tov began with these friends in Tel Aviv, and therefore it's defined by their Tchum Shabbos, because that was kind of the whole point of Reuven being mizakeh the food to Shimon, so that it will be, with these friends in Tel Aviv and be governed by their Tchum Shabbos. Okay, fine. Rav Chana bar Chaniloi, very fun. Who's Rav Chana bar Chaniloi? We had a Gemara in Masechta Brachos and Daf Nun Ches. There's a story with Ula and Rav Chizda that they were traveling and they passed by the house of Rav Chana bar Chaniloi, and Rav Chizda sort of cried out. And they describe Rav Chana bar Chaniloi, his house was mamish like the house of Avram, like the tent of Avram Avinu. People would just come in and coming out. He would just give tons and tons of tzedakah and feed people and make sure that everybody had what they needed. And then his house got destroyed. So this is Rav Chana bar Chaniloi, this big tzaddik. So Rav Chana bar Chaniloi tolebisa be'ividadasha. So Rav Chana bar Chaniloi, he was staying in somebody else's house, right? So he lived wherever he lived. And he was a guest somewhere 4,000 amos away from his house. And wherever he was in this guest house, he was planning to walk back to his house on Yom Tov. He made an Eruvey tehumin. He was going to walk back to his house on Yom Tov. So he's staying at some guest house somewhere. He made an Eruvey tehumin so that he could walk back to his house on Yom Tov. So now, Talabiso Bivididasha, and he hung some meat on his door bolt. Now it's unclear yet who hung the meat, but there was some meat hanging on his door bolt. And the question is, he wanted to know, can he take this meat with him back to his house, relying upon the Eruv tehumin that he made? Also the Kamed Rav Huna. So Rav Chana bar Chaniloi comes to Rav Huna. Omale. And what did Rav Huna say to Rav Chana bar Chaniloi? I'at tolis zil shkol. So Rav Huna says, look, if you hung the meat on the door bolt, so then you could take them back with you. The inu talulach lo tishkol. But if the people at the guest house hung the meat for you on the door, so then you cannot rely upon your Eruv tehumin to go back to where you live. But then 1 second. The Gemara asks, but I don't understand. How could Rav Huna be paskening for Rav Chana bar Chaniloi that if Rav Chana bar Chaniloi himself hung the meat on the door bolt, he can then rely upon the Eruv tehumin that he made to take it back to his house? But Rav Huna Talmud de Rav Abba. But 1 second, Rav Huna was a student of Rav. V'amar Rav, and Rav said that when you have Reuven and Shimon, and Reuven puts his fruits in Shimon's chotzer, the Tchum Shabbos is defined by Shimon. And therefore, even if Rav Chana bar Chaniloi hangs this meat on the door bolt of his host, but the Tchum Shabbos is going to be defined by his host's Tchum Shabbos, not his Tchum Shabbos. And therefore, even though he made an Eruvey tehumin, that should be irrelevant. According to Rav, when Reuven puts fruits in Shimon's chotzer, the Tchum Shabbos is defined by Shimon's Tchum Shabbos. And here also, Rav Chana bar Chaniloi, in a real life example, hung meat on his host's door bolt. I don't know what a door bolt is, but whatever. Something to do with the door, mistama. So he hung it on the door. So it should be governed by his host's Tchum Shabbos. So how could Rav Chana bar Chaniloi then take it back with him to his house 4,000 amos away? So, Shiny Avr Didasha Tichmishiichi Lo Keren Zavis Dami. So the Gemara wants to answer that in this case where Rav Chana bar Chanilai went to the door of the room where he was staying and he hung the meat himself, and the host didn't accept responsibility of guarding it over here. It's basically the equivalent of him having his own space in the guest house that's considered his, and therefore it'll be governed by his own Tchum Shabbos. Alright. Amalei Rav Hillel Rav Ashi, so says Rav Hillel to Rav Ashi, v'i inu talule lo shakil. So Rav Huna had said, and if the host would have hung the meat on the door, so then Rav Chana bar Chanilai would not have been able to take the meat back with him to where he lives. Ve'omer Shmuel, but Shmuel says, Shor shel patam areu k'ragle kol adam. So Rav Huna had said that if the hosts would have hung the meat on the doorpost, so Rav Chana bar Chanilai would not have been able to take the meat back with him to his house. But didn't Shmuel say that when you have an ox of a fattener, so whoever buys that ox could take it wherever their Tchum Shabbos will allow them to go? Because a fattener assumes that, well, somebody's going to be taking this ox, and whoever takes it, it'll be defined by their Tchum Shabbos, not mine. So here also, this host was essentially had this meat that he knew he was going to be giving away to Rav Chana bar Chanilai, so shouldn't it Memele be defined by Rav Chana bar Chanilai's Tchum Shabbos? Amalei Ravina Rav Ashi, says Ravina to Rav Ashi, v'i inu talule lo shakil. So he also asks, what if the hosts would have put the meat on the doorway, then Rav Chana bar Chanilai would not be allowed to bring the meat back with him? But didn't Rabbi Bar Chana say in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that when there's one shepherd in the city, so memele you can assume that whatever sheep or whatever livestock you can have, you're going to be giving to that shepherd, and therefore it can be governed by the Tchum Shabbos of that shepherd. So here also, since the host was going to be giving this meat to Rav Chana bar Chanilai, so shouldn't it be defined by Rav Chana bar Chanilai's Tchum Shabbos even if the host hung it on his door? Amr le Rav Ashi Rav Kahana, and also Rav Ashi says to Rav Kahana, also the inu talule lo shakil, if the host would have hung the meat on the door bolt of Rav Chana bar Chanilai, Rav Chana bar Chanilai would be unable to take it back with him to his city. Ve'atnan, but we learn in the Mishnah that when you have an animal, or if you have vessels, the Tchum Shabbos is defined by their owner's Tchum Shabbos. And here also, we should say that since the host hung this meat on the door bolt for Rav Chana bar Chanilai, he should be considered the owner of the meat, and therefore it should be governed by his Tchum Shabbos, and he should be able to take them back to his home, relying upon his Eruvey tehumin. Elo shiny Rav Chana bar Chanilai degaverabu v'tard b'shmaita. So the Gemara says, wait a second. This is not an issue of Tchum Shabbos. Assuming that Rav Chana bar Chanilai would be able to take this meat back to his house, he made an Eruvey tehumin, he could, whatever it is, don't worry about Tchum Shabbos. This is not a question of Tchum Shabbos, this is a different question. It's a question of, can we assume that this meat is kosher meat? Because after all, shiny Rav Chana bar Chanilai, I'm going to read that again, Rav Chana bar Chanilai is different. The Gavarabu v'tard b'shmaiti, Rav Chana bar Chanilai was a great man, and he was so engrossed in his studies, in his studying of Torah, that he wasn't paying attention to what was going on. And this is what Rav Huna was saying to Rav Chana bar Chanilai. I'atolis islach simona bigave v'lo maschas daitoch mine. Zil Shkol. If you, Rav Chana bar Chanilai, were the one to hang this meat on the door bolt, well then you'll be paying attention to it. And because you'll be paying attention to it, you could take it with you. Meaning, the concern is, if there's just meat hanging on a door bolt, well, you have to be paying attention to it because maybe birds will come and swap it out with non-kosher meat or whatever it is. And therefore, since Rav Chanan bar Chanilai was so engrossed in his learning, he wasn't paying attention to what's happening with the meat. And therefore, who knows, maybe a bird came and swapped it out with non-kosher meat. And therefore, what Rav Huna is saying is that if Rav Chanan bar Chanilai hung it on the doorpost himself, on the doorbolt himself, so then Mimele, we can assume that he was also paying attention to it. Right? He was invested in it, he hung it himself, he was paying attention, he was making sure that it in fact remained the meat that he hung there and that it was kosher. But if they were the ones to hang the meat on the doorbolt, which makes Rav Chanan bar Chanilai not involved in this meat very much, so he wouldn't be paying attention to it, and who knows, maybe a bird could have come and swapped it out for some other non-kosher meat. And therefore, that is what Rav Huna was saying to Rav Chanan bar Chanilai. It's not a question of Tchum Shabbos, it's a question of, is this meat kosher or not? And what he's saying is, if you hung the meat yourself on the doorbolt, well then we can assume that you were paying attention to it, and therefore you can assume that it's the kosher meat that you hung there, and sure, go Givaldik, take it home with you. But if you were not the one, but if you were not the one to hang it on the doorpost, on the doorbolt, well then, we cannot assume that you were paying attention to it, and therefore we cannot assume that it's kosher, and therefore don't take it home with you. Very interesting. From the fact that Rav Chanan bar Chanilai was able to ask Rav Huna, I assume that we're talking about that this story happened in Surah, which is also interesting because the story in Brachos was also with Rav Chisda, was also from Surah. So I wonder if this all, it's the same generation, and I guess maybe in the area of Surah, maybe he was a guest in Surah, which I guess would make sense. Maybe he went to Surah for Yom Tov to be with Shmuel, to be with Rav Huna, and then, he was planning to go back the next day, maybe. Anyways. Okay, very interesting. Okay, so now we get to the final Mishnah of masechta Beitzah. In mashkim v'shochatin es amidbarius, aval mashkim v'shochatin es abaisis, so we cannot give to drink and then slaughter the, I think the article said range animals. Okay, we'll have to define what these desert animals are. Aval mashkim v'shochatin es abaisos, but you can, right, so you cannot give to drink and slaughter the range animals, but you can give to drink and then slaughter the domesticated animals. And the Gemara is going to explain, what does drinking have to do with anything? Eluein baisos, these are the domesticated animals. Halonus ba'ir, well, if they sleep in the city, if they rest in the city, so then they're domesticated animals. Midbarios halonus be'afar, what are range animals? Those are animals that sleep out in the dirt, outside of the city. Okay, we're going to define these things a little better. Lamali lemeimar mashkim v'shochatin. Fact the Gemara, what does giving to drink have to do with anything? How come it has to say that we give these animals to drink and then slaughter? Just say slaughter the animals. So milsagav orche kamashmalan. So the Gemara answers, well, it's teaching us, it's teaching us sort of good practice. That it's good practice to first give the animal to drink before slaughtering it, because by giving the animal to drink first, it makes the hide easier to remove. So the Gemara, there's nothing, no halacha regarding, we're not saying you have to drink or whatever it is, but we're recommending that why don't you give the animal first to drink, because it'll make it easier to remove the hide. So sort of drinking and slaughtering go hand in hand. Taner Abanan, the rabbis taught, Eluein Midbarius, this is the definition of range animals, Ve'eluein Baisos, and this is the definition of domesticated animals. Midbarius, Kol Sheyotzus Bepesach, Ve'ros Ba'afar, the range animals, they leave the city Pesach time, and they spend some time outside of the city, V'nichnosos Be'Revia Rishona, and then when it starts to rain in Mar Cheshvan, which we're in right now, so then they come back to the city. Those are range animals. Ve'eluein Baisos, and these are domesticated animals, Kol Sheyotzos V'ros Chutz L'Tchum Uvos V'lonos B'socha Tchum, that they go out and they range outside of the Tchum, but then they always come back to the Tchum, inside of the Tchum to sleep. Those are the domesticated animals. Okay, fine. So Tanakama says that the range animals, they leave every year at Pesach and they come back in Mar Cheshvan. We don't see them in between. Whereas the domesticated animals, they don't go too far. They come back every night to sleep. Fine. Rebbe Omer Elu ve'elu Beitzah. Whereas Rebbe's opinion is that no, both of these definitions would be considered domesticated animals. They come back every year to Mar Cheshvan, they come home, that's domesticated. Even if they might spend the summer away, they ultimately come home, that's domesticated. Ela Elu Midbarius, this is how you define a range animal. Kol sheyotzos v'roz be'ofer ve'ein nichnosus liyeshuv lo b'mosachama v'lo b'mosagshom. Rebbe says, look, in order for something to properly be considered a range animal, it has to leave and never come back. Not in the summer, not in the winter. It's out of town. It doesn't come back. That is a proper range animal. And that is what the Mishnah is talking about, that if it's a range animal, then you cannot slaughter it on Yom Tov because it's Muktzeh. It's not something that you have in mind you had any intention that you'd be able to slaughter this animal on Yom Tov, because after all, it's a range animal. Rebbe says it leaves the city and never comes back. But a domesticated animal, you'd be able to slaughter. And Rebbe says, even if it goes out after Pesach and only comes back to Mar Cheshvan, as long as it comes home, it's still considered a domesticated animal, and you'd be allowed to slaughter it on Yom Tov. But does Rebbe really hold of Muktzeh? Does Rebbe really hold of Muktzeh? Because this whole thing, right, Rebbe's chiming in to define what a range animal is versus a domesticated animal. And what's the point? Well, because we have to know if we could slaughter it or not. If it's a range animal, you can't slaughter it. If it's a domesticated animal, you can slaughter it. Well, why can't you slaughter a range animal? Well, because it's Muktzeh. You don't have any intention that you'll be able to slaughter it. That you don't have any intention that you're going to be, eating it. It's a range animal. It's gone. It's not on your mind. You're not thinking about it. Why would you be slaughtering a range animal? So therefore it's Muktzeh. You're not allowed to slaughter it. But then the Gemara says, but since when does Rebbe hold of Muktzeh bichlal? V'abba mine Reb Shimon by Rebbe me Rebbe, but Rebbe's son Reb Shimon by Rebbe asked him, Patz'ile Tmar le Reb Shimon Ma'u. According to Reb Shimon, who does not hold of Muktzeh, so what about these Patz'ile Tmar? That if you have these dates on the tree that will never become ripe, there's certain dates that they will just never become ripe. But what you do, they will never become ripe on the tree. What you do is you take the dates, you put them in a basket, and then in the basket they become ripe. And while they're in the basket, while they're ripening, you could still technically eat them. So Reb Shimon Rebbe asked his father, what would Reb Shimon say about these dates that you take off the tree to put in the basket to ripen? Would they be considered Muktzeh on Shabbos and Yom Tov? Omar le, and Rebbe responded, Ein Muktzeh le Reb Shimon ele grogos v'tzimukin bilvad. That Reb Shimon, his definition of Muktzeh is only by grogros v'tzimukim. That Rebbe says when it comes to drying out figs and drying out raisins, that basically you take these fruits, these grapes and these figs, and you take them with your hands and you specifically put them on your roof and saying, I'm going to forget about you until you're dried out, and then they're not edible in the interim because they get rotten until they get dried. Reb Shimon agrees that in that case there would be Muktzeh. When we say that Reb Shimon doesn't hold the Muktzeh, that doesn't mean that he doesn't hold the Muktzeh at all. In certain cases like this, where you specifically took these fruits and put them away for a long period of time, and in that interim they're inedible, Reb Shimon would agree that that would be Muktzeh. But something like this, where you're just taking some figs and putting them in a basket so that they can ripen, but you can even technically eat them right now, Reb Shimon would say that that would not be Muktzeh. Even though maybe, you weren't planning on eating them for a little bit, but you can eat them. We can assume that you had them in mind, and that's fine, according to Reb Shimon. So what do we see? So we want to assume that from the fact that Rebbe is answering a question about Reb Shimon's opinion, So then can't we assume that Rebbe actually holds, like Reb Shimon, that there's no Muktzeh? And therefore, why would Rebbe be weighing in on this question about what's considered midbarios versus baisos in terms of what would be considered Muktzeh in terms of slaughtering? I thought Rebbe doesn't hold of Muktzeh. From the fact that he's answering a question about Reb Shimon's opinion, doesn't that mean that Rebbe holds like Reb Shimon? That there's no Muktzeh? So, Ibaisem, I can give three answers. The first answer is, Haninami kigrogos v'tzimukin dami. Well, maybe you could say that just like Reb Shimon ultimately does hold of Muktzeh by grogros v'tzimukin, by these drying figs and raisins, because you specifically put them away, and they're going to be away for a while, and they're going to be rotten in the meantime. Well, maybe these range animals that don't live in the city, they live in the wild. So that's kind of like the equivalent of these raisins that are drying, that really you have no relationship with. So that's one answer. That even if Rebbe holds like Reb Shimon, maybe you can argue that these range animals are essentially the equivalent of drying figs and grapes. If you want, I will say, or you could say, look, Reb Shimon Rebbe's son asked him a question about Reb Shimon's opinion, so he answered him about Reb Shimon's opinion, that Reb Shimon only holds of Muktzeh by grogos v'tzimukin. That doesn't mean Rebbe never claimed to agree with Reb Shimon's opinion, to hold like Reb Shimon. His son asked him a question about Reb Shimon's opinion. He answered the question about Reb Shimon's opinion. He may not agree with Reb Shimon's opinion, but he was just answering a question. That doesn't mean that he holds like Reb Shimon. Maybe he holds like Reb Yehuda, that there is Muktzeh. And that's why he was talking about the range animals versus the domesticated animals, because he does in fact hold of Muktzeh. Or the opposite. I could say the opposite, which is that Rebbe holds like Reb Shimon, so then why is he answering questions about domesticated versus range? So l'dveim d'Rabbanan ka'amrlu. Maybe Rebbe, in the Beitzah, in terms of defining domesticated versus range in the context of Muktzeh, was really just responding to the rabbis. And he's saying, L'didi ein Muktzeh. He says, look, to me, I hold like Reb Shimon, I don't hold of Muktzeh. And therefore, whether they're baisos, whether they're midbarios, you could slaughter them anyways. L'didchu odu limias. But you, rabbis who hold of Muktzeh, don't you at least admit to me, but won't you agree to me that if they leave in Pesach time and they come back in Mar Cheshvan, that those are domesticated animals, they're not really range animals? To which the rabbi said, no, those are not domesticated animals, those are range animals, even though they come back in Mar Cheshvan. But Rebbe doesn't hold of Muktzeh. He's just having a dialogue with the rabbis who do hold of Muktzeh and questioning their definition of what range animals would be. And they're having a discussion around that, but you could argue that he does not hold of Muktzeh anyways. Hadron Olach, Mishilin Paris, Uslika masechta baya. Okay, we'll come back to Mishilin Paris and we're making a siyum of masechta baya. Friends, that was masechta Beitzah. Well, first of all, that was daf mem. Daf mem was a complicated daf. Can you imagine? This is basically one amud, and this took like an hour or something? Imagine if this was two amuds. This was real stuff over here. Anyway, so what did we talk about on daf mem? We talked about, first we talked about Tchum Shabbos. That when you have fruits in another city, so the Mishnah had said that if Reuven has fruits in a different city, so he's got to make a Tchum Shabbos, he's got to make an Eruv tehumin if he wants to take them, assuming that they're more than 2,000 amas away. If the people in the other city made a Tchum Shabbos, it wouldn't work for him. Now, we saw machlokas between Rav and Shmuel, that if Reuven takes his fruits and he puts them in Shmuel's courtyard, so Rav says that the Tchum Shabbos is based on Shmuel's Tchum Shabbos. Rav says that the Tchum Shabbos is based on Shimon's Tchum Shabbos. Shmuel says that the Tchum Shabbos is based on Reuven's Tchum Shabbos. Okay? We wanted to try to tie it into Machlokas and Bava Kama, which we said that no, Rav can argue, that both Rav and Shmuel would try to make the argument that both opinions in Bava Kama really agree with them by the fruits. Okay? Okay, and then so that was really, the bulk of kind of the first part of the Gemara, and then we got up to the second Mishnah, which ends off the masechta and talks about halachos of Muktzeh, which is that if you have range animals, so those would be Muktzeh because you don't really have them in mind. They're not domesticated animals that you generally slaughter. So if you have range animals, you cannot slaughter them on Yom Tif, and of course we said give them to drink and slaughter them, because first give them to drink so that it's easier to remove their hide. And if you have domesticated animals, you can slaughter them on Yom Tif. And then we got to a question of what's the definition of range versus domesticated. Tanna Kama says it would be considered range animals if they leave during Pesach and come back in Mar Cheshvan. That's already considered range animals, even though they come back, but they're away for like half the year. And domesticated animals would be if they basically come back to the city to sleep every night. And Rebbe says, Ma pitom. If they come back, even if they're away for half the year, if they ultimately come back, then they're considered domesticated. It says Rebbe, range animals would be animals that leave the city and never come back. Then the question was, does Rebbe really hold of Muktzeh? From the fact that he's chiming in on this machlokas, definitely sounds like he is conscious of the halachos of Muktzeh. But is that really true? After all, he fielded a question to his son, from his son, Reb Shimon Rebbe, about Reb Shimon's opinion, which would sound like he holds like Reb Shimon. So, and that there's no Muktzeh. So one way to answer is that, well, Reb Shimon doesn't never hold of Muktzeh. He only holds of Muktzeh in specific cases, of grogers v'tzimukin, where you basically deliberately put them away and they're inaccessible for a period of time. So maybe you could argue that even Reb Shimon would agree that by these range animals, which are never going to come back, that they would be like these grogos v'tzimukin, they're just inaccessible. So that's one way of answering. The other way of answering is to say that Rebbe holds like Reb Yehuda, that there is Muktzeh. And he was just answering a question that he was asked about Reb Shimon's opinion, but he doesn't hold like Reb Shimon's opinion. He holds like Reb Yehuda that there is Muktzeh. And the third way to answer it is to say that actually he holds like Reb Shimon that there is not Muktzeh. But in the Beitzah, he was just having a dialogue with the rabbis who do hold of Muktzeh, like Reb Yehuda, but he was saying, wait, but even if you hold that way, but still, I don't understand your definition of range animals. Okay, Givaldik, that was Daf Mem of masechta baya. I hope you enjoyed it very much. I hope you enjoyed masechta baya. And I hope that we're going to see you tomorrow for masechta Rosh Hashanah. Have a great day. Cheers.